All right. So, data mining. How many people have heard the phrase data mining before? Has anybody heard it?
I have.
Okay. Okay, there are a few of you. Of all the things we'll be talking about this semester, this is one of the biggest changes that has happened in the world in the past, I don't know, 25 years. Um, Data mining is something that, as it exists now, has it's unlike things that have come before in terms of scale and power. And because of that, just the way that people interact with each other, and especially the way that companies interact with individuals and the way governments can interact with individuals, is just fundamentally different from the ways it's come before. So first off, what is data mining? Well, first off, what is mining? And I mean that in a literal sense of like gold mining.
Basically, like physically going somewhere where you think there's like loot, and then just like using a pickaxe or whatever the tools are to mine it out.
Yeah, what you basically do is you go somewhere where there's something very valuable, gold, diamonds, something in the dirt. And what you do is you go there and you separate out the huge amounts of plain old dirt from the small amounts of very, very valuable things. So in like a diamond mine, you'll end up with like one small diamond for several like rooms full of dirt. And data mining's the same thing. What you do is you mine through huge amounts of data and you take out all large amounts of junk in the hopes of finding a small amount of very valuable information. And so what data mining essentially is you take a huge amount of data that's been collected in other ways, and then you just run computer calculations over it, looking for correlations between different variables. Then you take those correlations to make predictions about the people whose data that is. So, for instance, what you might do is you might collect large amounts of medical data. And so you take someone's weight, their where they live, their height, their history of substance abuse, any of this stuff, and you just put it into basically a giant Excel spreadsheet with all this information there. Then once you have all that information, what you do is you just run a computer program over it that looks to find correlations. So a classic case would be if you put everyone's weight and height into a chart, what you generally find is what? What is the relationship between height and weight in general? Well, generally, on average, the taller you are, the more on average you weigh. It's not a guarantee, but if you look across a large population, you're able to make predictions. So if you find out how tall someone is, you can make some assumptions about their height. They won't be perfect, but that's the general idea. Now, in this case, it's something that we all understand. Why is a taller person heavier? Well, their frame is bigger, therefore they're going to weigh more. But what data mining allows you to do is, because a computer can just sift through huge amounts of data very, very quickly, it can look for correlations in things that no human being would ever think exists, and in so doing, discover what's called implicit data within these larger data sets. And that implicit data can be very, very valuable. So one other thing, what is the definition of implicit versus explicit? Anyone familiar with these terms from ordinary discussion or ordinary life or the news or anything? Well, let me think of something that's explicit. Maybe you've heard this in the context of racism. Has anyone heard?
It's implicit is like it's not directly stated, but then explicit is directly stated. Yeah. And implicit gives a lot of leeway most of the time, or actually both of them, because it's like laws.
Yeah, explicit is something that's out there and obvious for everyone to see. So in explicit racism, this would be a case in which somebody uses the N-word or somebody doesn't hire someone because of their race. Implicit are cases that are less able to be seen. and you kind of have to reason out that they're there. So for instance, somebody who is implicitly racist might never say never use harmful language, but they're the CEO of a company that never hires people of color. That's a sign that even if they're not aware that they're racist, they might still be racist. So in these data sets, what you can think of is that the explicit data is the information that they collect and they're collecting. The implicit data are the conclusions a company might make on the basis of the data you provide explicitly. And this difference is important because sometimes we might be comfortable telling someone some explicit information about us, not realizing what implicit data they can actually infer or reason out or figure out on the basis of the explicit data. So I want to give a actual practical concrete example to explain these general sorts of notions. So the one I'm going to talk about is this Target case. And it's the way in which Target is able to take information, and most large companies do this, and draw conclusions about you, the customer, based on large data sets involving all their customers, and from there, cater your experience as a customer to what they think you're most likely to buy. So you walk into a Target or a Walmart or anything. You buy 10 things and then you leave. What information is collected by Target the moment you walk in? Or I guess more accurately, as long as you buy something, what information is going to be collected by them? Yeah, they're going to collect things like, there's usually going to be actually, I'm not sure if they're going to be able to explicitly grab your gender. If it's collated with like security footage, maybe. But in terms of things that are just explicitly there, like exactly written there, they'll collect that you're present. So you were there. And not only will they collect that you're there, they're going to collect what else about your presence? Not that you're there, but what else?
How long you're there?
How long and when? How long, when? Also, they're going to get your credit card info, and how many of you get like physical printed receipts, and how many of you get digital receipts?
I think mostly now it's mostly in person.
So these days they usually give you a choice, right? So how many of you, out of curiosity, get the physical receipt? The printed physical one. And how many of you get the digital one? And how many of you are just like, screw it, I don't need a receipt at all? Okay, so it looks like we're pretty split in terms of what. Now, if you do get the digital receipt, what information do they now have about you from your digital receipt?
Your email.
They have your email. Now, what else are they going to have if they have this other information about you? They're not just going to have your credit card number, presumably. What else is on your credit card?
Isn't it your address and stuff like that?
So very often, if you go, so other things, your name is going to be on it for sure. But depending on what you're buying and how you go about it, they might get your address. So if you go to a Target and buy a couch that you can't carry out, and you instead choose to have it shipped there, they now have your address. So all this information they have, what else do they know? What other things, if you go shopping at Target, does Target now have information about you? What other information about your trip to Target? Well, what are you, your purchases, what you buy. Now, why is this information useful? First glance, it doesn't seem like any of this information about you is necessarily that private or important to keeping yourself like secret or private, or keeping you safe, or to prevent Target from collecting too much information on you. But this is the key. What can Target do with all this information? Well, what you buy is not totally random. What you buy depends on a lot of other factors. So what are some examples you can think of something you buy telling the store information about you based on what you buy? And let's go with like common sense sorts of examples. Like, for instance, if you buy a 25 pack of diapers for the first time, what does that suggest? What can Target guess about you? You have a baby or you're about to have a baby. What are some other things? Your friend has a baby, so there's something baby-like. And once you know that, what else can you guess about a person? If you're buying diapers, what can we be pretty confident about? Yes, someone you know has a baby, but what do we know about you? So one thing, you know, as Cynthia just said, if you're buying diapers, you're probably going to be buying more diapers in the future. Also, how old are you? How old are you likely to be?
Like a younger person.
You're probably, I mean, you're not super young. Like, you're going to be greater than the age of 5. Like, no 5-year-old is going in and buying their own diapers. Also, you're probably like under the age of, or you're probably over the age of 14, because you're unlikely to be pregnant if you're under the age of 14. Then, so we know as a matter of fact, if you're buying these diapers, you're over the age of, say, 14. Now, we can make some other educated guesses. We won't be 100% certain, but we can be pretty sure that what age are you probably falling in? Well, odds are, if you're buying a lot of diapers, you're probably somewhere in like the 25 to 35 range. So we know something about you just based on the fact that you're buying diapers. Now, we don't know for certain because anything is possible, but if you're a company, this piece of information is useful. As soon as we know you're between the age of 25 and 35, what can we now do? What are some things about 25 to 35-year-olds that you can now predict? So if you were running Target, oh, Jorge.
With all the information you're starting to accumulate, I guess what you're gonna buy next for the people of that age bracket.
Yeah, so you now know some things that these people are likely to buy and some things that they're not likely to buy. So a 25 to 35-year-old who's buying diapers, what are some things they probably also need to be buying? Baby food. What else? That's a really good one. Baby clothes. What else? Or what are some things? Baby toys. What are some other things they might not be intending to buy? Like, if you know this person's buying a major collection of diapers, what are they probably not also buying? Yeah, if they're buying like large, they're probably not going to buy like 47 cases of beer if they're also buying baby food. Now, maybe they would, but it's rather unlikely. So what this is you can now, as Target, just from seeing that somebody bought diapers, you can begin to see what other things they would want to buy. And now on top of that, it's not just that you know what they're interested in buying. What can you now do for Target, if you're Target? How can you use this information to your advantage?
Professor,
Yeah.
like the way you stack your store, could it be?
That is one thing which is very, very likely to happen. So one thing which stores actually do is, if they know that people who buy diapers also need other things, what they might do is put the diapers in the back of the store, and to get to the diapers, you have to walk past baby food and toys and new baby clothes. So that when you walk past that and you're in a rush and you've got kids, you are more likely to notice the things that you might also need. And if you're stressed and overtired, like most parents are when you have small children, you're going to be less likely to think, do I really need this? You're just going to go, oh, that's a cute baby shirt, grab it. So they can set up the store to encourage you to buy things that they want you to buy. What else might they do? Also, yeah, Cynthia says, you put the toys there, so the kids sitting in the thing are screaming, I want it, I want it. And an exhausted parent is going to find it easier to just buy the kid the toy than they are to tell the kid you're not getting a toy. So it's not just that Target's able to exploit this information to get you to buy it. They are also able, simply from knowing you buy diapers or buying pull-ups or buying things like this, they're able to arrange their store to take advantage of the fact that you might have a child with you who is going to look at the brightly colored toys and try to encourage you, the parent, to buy those things. So what other things might you know about? Or what else can you do if you're Target? You've organized the store in a certain way. What else can you do? Especially if you've got this one as well. Or this one.
Coupon.
Yeah, coupons. You can send people coupons. So if you're Target and you want a customer to buy, so imagine they're coming to, mail out coupons, discounts. What you can now do is send them, the person, targeted coupons based on what they're likely to buy. So if you figured out this person's 25 to 35, you can send them coupons for diapers, send them coupons for baby food, send them coupons for things that are baby related. You can also then not send them coupons for things they don't need. So every time Target sends you a coupon booklet, it costs them money to send out. Not a lot of money, but it's some money. So if they are only able to have sales on like violent video games, and they know because this person's buying adult diapers that the person at this store is actually somewhere between age 65 and 90, they're not going to bother sending those coupons. Because why? Well, this person isn't going to be buying violent video games if they're 90 years old, presumably. At the very least, they're very unlikely to do that. So simply by seeing what someone buys, you're able to begin to draw conclusions about what other things they'll buy and set up your store, set up your website, set up everything accordingly. So that's the first level of data mining. And so this is a way in which explicit data, namely you bought diapers, tells you about implicit data, namely you're probably between ages 25 and 35, and you probably have a child. So these are rather simple things, but it becomes way more powerful when you start running the computer programs that just look for correlations and give statistics on it, because computers that just look over large data sets are likely to find correlations that other people, like a human brain, would never think to look for. So this was the actual Target case. What happens is every time you walk into Target, your purchases are recorded. And then if you use the same credit card as before or same email address, your purchases from every other purchase in your past will also be recorded. Because of this, what they can do is gather a lot of information about your patterns and identify when they change. And so it's not just that they know what you buy now, they can identify they can identify when your purchases change. Because when people's purchases change, it's generally a sign that something in their life has changed. If you're suddenly buying a lot more paper towels, that probably suggests that there's somebody else in your life. Either you have a new roommate who makes a mess, or you had surgery and your hands are shaky, or you've got a dog and you have to clean its feet off all the time. All of that is now, like, any of that could be the explanation for why your behaviors have changed. And so one thing that Target's been able to do is start to identify who is pregnant long before these people actually are showing, and long before they ever tell Target that they're pregnant. And the way that Target has been able to do this is through data mining. So what they basically did is look at all the purchases that people make. And what they did is, by looking at this, all the purchases, and coming up with correlations, well, they started off with the baby registry. What is a baby registry? So if Target has a baby registry, what is that? Or Walmart or Amazon or any company has a baby registry. Anyone know?
I think it's like you take a list of how many babies there are, and like like what they really need, like the age range?
Yeah, so basically it involves taking a list of people who voluntarily say, we have a baby or we're expecting a baby. And people sign up for these lists because if you're on the list, Target will send you baby related coupons. So they'll send you coupons for diapers. They'll send you coupons for these sorts of things. So by signing up for the baby registry, you are giving Target now an additional piece of information, namely, here are my purchases. And I or partner are pregnant. Now, why is this significant? Why is it valuable to know that this person or their partner is pregnant and what their purchases are? Well, again, you are able to predict things like, well, one, you're able to learn more about what pregnant people or people with pregnant partners buy. And not only that, once you know what pregnant people buy, you can look for people who buy those things and predict who is pregnant. So one thing they found looking at the baby registry was things like unscented hand lotion, unscented candles. So what they found is people who were on the baby registry started buying unscented hand lotion and unscented candles at a much higher rate than they did before there was any baby in the picture. Now, why is this the case? Well, in some sense, it doesn't really matter because all Target needs is to know that it's the case. So what can they now do with this information? What can they do now that they know that people who are pregnant often buy unscented hand lotion and unscented candles? How is Target going to use this information?
I think they're just basically gonna try to either target you with unscented candles and like sending like sending emails and like things in the mail, probably like a bunch of letters.
They're going to send you emails, they're going to send you letters, but most importantly, you don't ever have to have told them that you're pregnant. All you had to do was start buying these candles, and they are able to deduce someone in your house is probably pregnant, which means they can then start sending you the emails for the diapers, for the baby food, for toys, for other baby crap. So you never have to tell them that you're pregnant. All you have to do is go to a Target and think, I'd like some unscented hand lotion. And when you get that unscented hand lotion and it's hooked up to your account, even if you aren't on the baby registry, Target now is pretty confident that you're pregnant. And so this is one of the factors they used. But by looking at things like unscented hand lotion, and there are many other things that we wouldn't think of as signals that you're pregnant, but that are on the list, because if you look at a large enough data set at the entire baby registry of hundreds of thousands of people, what you find is certain factors are high indicators that somebody's probably pregnant. And therefore, even if no one says it, you can end up knowing that they're pregnant and using that information. So the actual case that brought this to light was because what Target did is there was a 16-year-old girl who was shopping at Target and bought things that were indicative of the fact she was pregnant. What did Target do? How did they respond to this? Well, they knew where she lived because of her information. So what did they do to her? Or what did they do for her, I guess would be a bit nicer way. Well, they sent her coupons. And what did the coupons say? Anyone have any guesses? Cynthia's 100% correct. They sent a thing that said, congrats on your child. Needless to say, the 16-year-old's father was not pleased. and said, why the hell are you sending me this information? My daughter's 16. Are you trying to encourage her to get pregnant? Target was like, oh my God, we're so sorry. This was a mistake. They sent the information up the like Target food chain and had somebody in like district office call the father and be like, we're just following up. We're so sorry. And the father responded with, well, actually, truth is, my daughter is pregnant. After this happened, I had a long conversation and she admitted to me that she was pregnant. So the dad found out his daughter was pregnant because Target found out first and sent the daughter a coupon. Now, this is the sort of thing that should begin to start making us feel a little bit uncomfortable. Remember we talked last time, we like to have control over the narrative of our lives. We like to know and decide who knows what about us. So you might be like, all right, I feel fine telling a company my weight. I feel fine telling them my birthday. I feel fine telling them where I live. The issue is, as soon as they have that data and what you purchase, they can start finding a lot about you that you don't want them to know. So Target did this, and there was a big PR stink because everyone was like, Target is finding out that you're pregnant before you are. Does anyone hypothesize or know how Target got around this problem or what they did in response? Or can anyone take a guess? First question is, did they stop sending people coupons when they found out they were pregnant?
No.
No. Did they keep sending things that said, congratulations on your child?
Probably they kept sending.
So here's the key. If you didn't tell Target you were pregnant and they said, congratulations on your first child, how would that make you feel personally? Just go inside, check your feelings. How would that make you feel? Are you fine with that, or do you feel a little uneasy? Cynthia's a little scared. I would feel uncomfortable or uneasy. So therefore, Target realized, oh, this is a terrible plan. People really don't like this. However, we don't want to stop reaping the benefits of this. We still want to make sure that we're giving coupons to people who have babies. So what did they start doing? Any predictions for what they started to do?
Either advertising or completely changing the way what's shown on their homepage.
So yeah, what they did is they changed things around, but they did it in such a way that the shopper didn't realize that they were getting changed around. So what they do is, it used to be that if you were on this, you get a big piece of paper that said, congrats, 20% off diapers, baby food, and toys. Congrats on your baby. People got this and were freaked out and uncomfortable. So now here's what Target sends. To our valued customers, 20% off lawnmowers, 20% off beer, 20% off diapers. So what they did is they started hiding the coupons they were actually directing in amongst other coupons they knew somebody would never use. So because they knew you were pregnant, they knew you needed diapers, but they also knew you didn't want to feel like they knew you needed diapers. So therefore they put things also in the coupons that they knew you would think like, oh, if they're sending me lawnmower advertisements, they don't know I'm pregnant. They're not targeting me. They aren't invading my privacy. When in truth, no, they know exactly that you're pregnant and that you have no need for a lawnmower or for beer. They just know that if you don't know they know, you're going to be more likely to buy things at Target because you don't feel like your privacy is being invaded. So how many people, we talked last time about like privacy, and in the modern world, people don't really mind this sort of thing the way they used to. But when you start to look at the actual concrete cases of what companies are able to do via data mining, how many people begin to feel a little less comfortable? Is there anyone who is like, well, I'm fine if the doctor knows this stuff, but it's weird to me that Target finds out if I'm pregnant. Theoretically, Target could find out you're pregnant before you do. because like maybe you're buying new unscented hand lotion just because your hormones have changed and you're incredibly sensitive to smell, and you don't realize yet that that's why the unscented hand lotion smells good to you. And therefore, Target knows you're pregnant before you do. Is there anyone who finds these sorts of things at all troubling or worrying? I'm just curious, just feeling out the room here. Or are we still on board with the sort of like, whatever. I'm so unprivate.
Honestly, I'm not even too sure yet. Like for me, it's like, oh, should I really be worried? Because like, what would the world look like without all this? Like, how would it look like without all these targeted advertising and like data mining?
Yeah, so one thing, I mean, and going back to the other side, there are benefits to this. Like if you need diapers, getting a coupon for diapers is nice. It's just somewhat concerning because one thing this sets up is a major difference in the power dynamics between companies and individuals. Why is it that companies are able to gather this information, but you or I cannot?
Code of conduct.
Not just, it's not really a code of conduct case in this sense. What do they have access to that we do not?
Oh, they have all access to whoever is using their services.
Yeah, they just have a lot more data, Jorge.
No, I was going to say the same thing. They have the access to gather that data.
So they have access to gather it, and then they also have the money to get the computers to process this. So like big data is a term you'll hear, and big data is basically just companies who run these sorts of tests on the data and run these sorts of considerations. And yeah, the other thing that's worrying is because they have all this data, or because they're wealthy enough and they have it all, they can then sell this data to other companies. So what ends up happening is instead of just having your data, and this was something we talked about a couple classes, or I guess last class, is that data can now be exchanged much more easily. So what ends up happening is you end up with organizations like Google, organizations like Facebook, organizations like Amazon, who have huge amounts of data and the money and infrastructure to analyze it in ways that the average person can never, ever come close to. And because of this, basically, is Facebook free? Well, in one sense, yes. How many of you have ever paid money to Facebook to use it? No, you don't. However, what do you pay it? Because it's not free in a certain sense. What is Facebook's money? How does Facebook make money?
With all the information they gather, right?
Yeah, you pay them in data. That you pay Facebook in who your friends are, in what you are interested in what you pay, and everything else. So based on this, what Facebook is able to do is give advertisers incredibly nuanced and detailed information about their customers. So through Facebook, you can find out who someone's friends are. You can generally pretty quickly find out their political views. You can find out where they lived. You can find out how many kids they have. And therefore, what you can do as an advertiser is spend money in a more, so like in the good old days, America, there is a considerable amount of disagreement about what we should do with these things. Some people think they're great. Other people think they shouldn't exist. So if you were a company that sold guns, who would you want to sell them to? Who would be your target audience? Well, people who are going to buy them, people who are pro-guns. Back in the day, you wouldn't know who the pro-gun people are. So if you had $1 million to spend and say only 30% of people are interested in buying guns, then you spend $1 million on, and say you spend $1 per person. So you spend $1 million, you talk to 1 million people, you send one advertisement to 1 million people, but only 30%. So you're spending $1 million to reach out to 300,000 potential customers. However, based on Facebook data, Facebook can tell pretty quickly who might be interested in buying a gun and who might not be, based on whether they have Second Amendment things printed on their website. So what you as a company could do is, instead of spending $1 million to get 300,000 customers, you pay, say, $200K to Facebook. Facebook says, here are the 300,000 people who might buy guns. And then at the same rate of $1 per customer, you spend $1 per customer. And so your total, you save $500,000 on advertising by going through Facebook. So that's why companies are trying to do this. You find out who your potential customers are, so you don't waste money paying people who aren't going to buy your products. So that's how Facebook makes its money. It sells your data to people who then use that data to advertise to you. Now, thus far, I've been talking about cases in which data mining is used to make accurate predictions about things. The problem is that sometimes the sorts of outputs of these, or like when you find a correlation, there's no guarantee that it's 100% correct. So going back to the diaper one, somebody's buying diapers. Are you 100% certain that they are going to be having a baby? Are you 100? Somebody buys 10 diapers, or say 100 diapers. They're saying it could be that this person's pregnant, and in fact, it's very likely. However, what else might they be doing? Well, they might be buying for a neighbor. What else? What other reasons would somebody buy diapers? There are many reasons. Yeah, you might be selling them. You might be using them for a science experiment on absorption for whatever reason. You might be getting them for a gift. You might not have the baby. You might be getting them as a gift for your grandchild. You might be getting them for a baby shower game. There are many reasons you could get it. So here's where the problem comes in, is when what Target does with all this data, or any big company, is they start spitting out predictions on how likely something is. So if you buy diapers, they're going to say 95% chance you're pregnant, or someone in your family's pregnant. Now, or they might start saying things like, if you buy the scented stuff, they'll say 80%. And how do they come up with these numbers? Well, what they do is they just basically get a data scientist in who does a bunch of math, and it spits out this number. The problem comes when these algorithms are being used on things that are not simply baby showers, but are rather being used on bigger picture, bigger consequence things like, should you be given a loan? So why does this matter? Well, whenever you go to a bank and try to get a loan, what do they look at? Well, they look at anything. What is a bank's number one goal with a loan? Why do they give you a loan, and who do they want to give loans to? Well, what is getting a loan? Let's start there, bare level. What is to get a loan from a bank? Say you're trying to start a business.
Getting us some amount of money without actually having to pay, or you pay it off in the, overturning.
Exactly. It's if you need to start a business, say you need $100,000, but in your pocket you only have 10K. You couldn't start your business. So instead, you go to the bank, who offers you 100K up front, and then the agreement is, over the course of, say, 5 years, you'll pay them the original price plus interest. So over the course of 5 years, you'll pay them back 110K. So the bank makes money off of it, and you're able to start your business. So when the bank is trying to decide who to give these loans to, who do they want to give it to? Somebody who's going to pay it back, or somebody who's not going to pay it back?
Someone who has a high chance of paying it back.
Yeah, you give them in the same way that you would only lend money to a friend if you thought they'd pay you back. A bank is only going to give somebody money if they think you're going to pay it back. So banks, there's a big amount of money in identifying whether or not you as a person are likely to be able to pay back your bank. And that's basically what a credit score is initially designed to do. A credit score is a number designed for credit companies, banks, credit card companies, to say this person's likely to pay back their money. And if they do, then you might want to give them a credit card. If, however, they don't pay it back and they end up costing you money, they're a bad investment, don't give them the loan. So why is this a problem, and what does this have to do with data mining? Well, a lot of times what banks end up doing is they just take the quickest and easiest data available to judge whether they think you are a safe bet to give a loan to. So they start to look at things like what college. They start to look at things like where you live. They start to look at things like your major. They start to look at things like your credit card number or credit card score, your credit score. What type of business you're trying to start. So why is this a problem? Well, what ends up happening is that banks start making decisions not based on your individual case, but rather on cases similar to yours that aren't exactly the same. So for instance, what they might do is they find out that when people go to, say, an Ivy League school, the odds that they end up paying back their loan are, say, 90%. And if they go to a CUNY, the odds that they pay back their loan is 80%. So if you're a bank and you have $100,000 to give, who are you going to be more likely to give it to? The person who went to the Ivy League school or the person who went to the CUNY school? If you have to make a quick and dirty decision.
The Ivy League.
Yeah, you give it
Professor,
to yeah.
Maybe a side point, wouldn't they also look at more obscure things or more controversial, such as like a race or your gender?
So here's something, so I'm going to come back to that one in a second, because this is a really important one, where legally they aren't allowed to look at your race. They are not allowed to do that. However, just because you don't explicitly look at race, doesn't necessarily mean that you aren't controlling or thinking about race. So Howard says, wouldn't they want to give it to the CUNY student because the Ivy League school costs more? Well, here's the idea. It entirely, the bank, in a grand scheme of things, you might want to say something like, if an Ivy costs more and somebody is going there, then they probably have money already. And therefore, society as a whole would benefit more if it goes to the CUNY student. However, the bank's goal is to make money. And the only thing they're going to look at is that, well, a CUNY student is 80%, a bank is not, an Ivy is 90%, we're going with the Ivy. So what's the problem with this? What's the problem in this sort of thinking? Well, imagine that the Ivy League graduate is somebody who paid their way to get there. And imagine the CUNY student is a straight A student who's never failed to pay back money in their entire life. Well, what we end up with is a case in which the bank ends up deciding to give somebody money because of their algorithm. Even if we look on a more granular level, the CUNY student would be the better investment. So what ends up happening is the Ivy League student gets the benefit and then has that money to start their business, and the CUNY student does not, simply because of where they went to college. And that's entirely based on where they went to college and how the bank uses that information. So what you end up with are these things in which general broad stroke decisions are being made on the basis of your implicit data. Like in this case, implicitly, what they've said is if you go to CUNY, there's only an 80% chance. So you tell them, I went to CUNY. That's the explicit data. They then get the implicit data. This person is 80% likely not to pay back their, or 80%, only 80% likely to pay back their credit card debt or pay back their loan. This other person is 90% likely. We're going with them. And so what you have is these very broad decisions being made on the basis of not you individually, but rather very general decisions about the population. So what ends up happening is it's not just that Target ends up giving you like advertisements for these things. It's rather that when you're having children and other things, and all that implicit data ends up affecting how companies treat you in the future on things like loans. So back in the financial crisis in 2008, there were cases in which people who had perfect credit scores their whole lives weren't given loans for a house, weren't given mortgages simply because they lived in a county in which there was a high rate of mortgage foreclosure. So what happened is you had people who were very good candidates that just got ignored simply because of the fact that they lived somewhere where other people happened to be financially worse off. And so here's the case in which Jorge brings in race. So you are not allowed to do these sorts of things based on race and gender, etc. However, race in this country is correlated with lots of other things. What things can you use to predict what race somebody is?
Professor, even your yearly income, you
Yeah.
could guess.
So one thing is like looking at your income. Looking at an income of somebody might tell you, like, you can learn something about a person based on like what their race is more or less likely to be based on how much money they make. So what you end up doing is you as a company might say, we only give loans to people who make more than $60,000 a year, treating that as a way of just, being financially safe. But in truth, that might be an intrinsically racist sort of procedure. Cynthia says demographics. What do you mean by demographics here? Because you're 100% right, Cynthia. I just want to tease this out a little bit. Where they live is what Kirana says. That is exactly, yeah, location. So what zip code you have is another one. Like if I know you live, I can never remember what the zip codes are. I sometimes look them up. But like if here's Manhattan, if I know that you're in the zip code that has to do with down here versus the zip code that has to go right here, I probably know what your income is. And also there's a likelihood that I know what your race is. Why? Well, up here, as a matter of fact, this is the Upper West Side. We're talking lots of money. There's a large number of project houses down here, which given the history of the United States are generally populated by people of color. So what you end up with is you might not say we're choosing based on race. Instead, what you say is we're choosing based on likelihood, based on where someone lives. And we find that people who live here are less likely to pay back their loans than people that live here. So what you end up doing is without anybody trying, like the person who's doing this might not think they're being racist, but in effect, what they're doing is making it harder for people of color to get loans based entirely on these other correlations. So this is where the privacy stuff starts to become really dangerous. What ends up happening is it's not just that you get catered ads, it's rather that what is possible for you gets determined based on these algorithms calculated on the basis of these implicit data things. So for instance, and what you end up with are these self-fulfilling prophecies, where if you go to a school that isn't like the top notch, it's very difficult to break out of that by being excellent because they're always going to use this sort of big data information against you. So there are things like if you go to law school, if you have any interest in getting on the Supreme Court one day, it's very helpful to be a clerk for a Supreme Court justice. But they basically only give these clerking positions to people who go to one of the top 2 schools. So if you didn't get to one of those top 2 schools, that alone is going to prevent you from ever being able to accomplish that goal. So in this way, what ends up happening is as these algorithms get created, they end up making decisions for people on their lives, not based on you and what you've done, but simply based on what similarities you have to other people, surface level similarities. And as a company, those similarities are beneficial to your bottom line, but you can worry whether there's is there something deeply troubling that a company decides whether you get a loan based entirely not on what your life is and what your values are, but of where you live, or what school you went to, or what you majored in? Or you want to start a restaurant, but they decide you aren't a good investment simply because of what age you are. because they find that people who start restaurants before age 30 very rarely succeed, so they don't give you a loan. You could have the best restaurant idea, you could have everything perfectly planned, and yet you don't get the loan because their algorithm spits out bad. You are not likely simply because of these factors that are just general statistics. And so this ties in with something else, which is that how many people have heard this phrase before? Correlation does not equal causation. Anyone taken a psych class and heard this? Or any statistics class?
I've heard of it.
Okay, so let's explain it for those of you who haven't heard it. What is causation? What is it for one thing to cause another?
Like it's like cause and effect, but some causes and effect are like I don't know an example for this, but basically like if you say like you have if you kill somebody, you go to jail, say that, right? But then the correlation is like something that like isn't exactly like because of the causation.
Yeah, so a causation, when one thing causes another, it makes it happen. So for instance, I do this and I cause the marker to fall over. I caused it to fall. Gravity caused it. Another way of saying that is that if gravity didn't exist, this wouldn't fall. What is a correlation? What is it for two things to be correlated?
Professor, just citing that causation, what you're talking, what you're talking about right now, it just makes me go back to what you said about explicit. The causation is something that is explicit. You see the pen fall, but then you don't know the cost of what caused that.
Yeah, so the thing is, here's a way of thinking about it. What's explicit is give me 1 second, right? Same or at same outcome or at same time / together. So basically what happens is when you're looking at one thing causing another, all you actually see is one event following another. Like you see me let go of this and then you see it fall. So a cause, though, to say this causes it isn't just to say that one follows the other or one goes with the other. It's to say something more, that the one of them actually made it the case. Correlation, by contrast, is simply that two things go together. So for instance, to give a classical case of this, let me see if I can think of a good correlation of these two markers are going to move in a correlated fashion. When one goes up, the other goes up. When one goes this way, the other goes that way. So they're correlated together. Knowing that this one's going to move tells you that this one's going to move. But they are not causing each other to move. Instead, what's causing them both to move?
The person, right, moving.
Yeah, I'm causing them to move. So the issue is, very often what happens is we see things correlated together and we assume that one caused the other. So what actually is and this is a problem, because what people will start to do is use the correlations to explain. When you're doing a data study, all you can find is correlations. So you'll find things like where someone lives being correlated with political alliance or political allegiance. But what you find is, so for instance, people in the Bronx are by and large Democrats. Why is that the case? Is it something about the water in the Bronx that makes you a Democrat? So there's a correlation here between Bronx and down. But what's the causation? Why is it the case that people in the Bronx are very often. So it's a correlation. So we know based on the statistics that these two are correlated. Like if you live in the Bronx, there's an 80% chance you're a Democrat. But what actually causes it to be the case that people in the Bronx are so often Democrats? It goes back to some things we were talking about before.
Being like, it's like being poor. Like they assume that you're poor and like because you're living in the Bronx because of all the stereotypical stats, like, of course, and like you usually like you want human rights and race.
I was
Yeah.
gonna, yeah, I was
Who
gonna say
lives
that,
in the
Professor.
Bronx? Yeah, of course.
Sometimes the policies that are pushed by certain party are viewed as they are more in favorable to you, you know?
Yeah. So the reason there are so many Democrats in the Bronx is the Bronx has a large percentage of people of color. And generally in the United States, people of color are more likely to join the Democratic Party because of various historical things having to do with how people of color have been treated in this country for hundreds of years. So what we end up doing then is that we find cases in which there are these correlations. And what the worry is people just look at the correlation, not thinking about the causation, and start making decisions based off of it. And what ends up happening is if you don't think about the causation behind these correlations and just start making your models on how likely something is based on the correlation, it ends up being very exploitable. And big data ends up giving these algorithms that end up affecting things like, well, let's go with an example here and why this is such a problem. So here's something that prestige in colleges. Human beings like prestige and human beings like lists. And very often, people are told, like, go to the best college you can get into. Go there, you'll have more opportunities, yada, yada, yada. First off, to be clear, there's the correlation between what college you went to and how much you'll succeed is not as strong as people often think. But because of this, very often, what school you went to has a lot of effects on things. And then, so how do you measure prestige in colleges? What gets determined as a better college? Well, there's some ranking system somewhere. So basically, somebody comes along with a ranking system and decides what the best colleges are. So how many people have heard of the US News and World Report college rank? Have people heard of this? It's basically the biggest college rankings study that gets done each year. The way they do it is they basically they have a special formula, so nobody knows exactly how they do it, but it was basically just like a bunch of people, data scientists, got together and thought, well, what would be a good sign of a top school? What is it? What are some factors that would make a school better? So if you were designing this, what sorts of things do you think you would include in whether a college is good? The education you'll get there is better. What sorts of factors do you start thinking about? Graduation rate. So this is one of the things that gets included. What else goes in there? Transfer rate, things like how often people transfer to other schools. Tuition is one. Acceptance rate, and that's a big one. Acceptance, and this is the one I want to talk about. So acceptance rate. Why is acceptance rate thought of as a big thing to determine how good of a school something is? Well, what is acceptance rate? What is the acceptance rate of a school?
Basically, like, oh, how hard. It's like people judge it on how hard it is to get in.
But why do they do that? What?
Yeah, it's really prestige and like satisfying.
Yeah. So basically, all the acceptance rate is what percentage of people who apply get in, and the idea is that if you are a better school, more people will want to go there, and therefore it should be harder to get into. So built into the US News and World Report rank is things like acceptance rate.
Professor.
Yeah.
I don't know. I was thinking maybe the prestige of the college is also gained by who goes there actually. Like
Yeah.
if you have several former presidents or,
Yeah, that's another major thing that goes in. And I think those things get included in this report. If there are multiple people there, financial aid is also something that definitely gets incorporated in. Another thing is they want to see, have they created competence? But the one thing that's tough with that one, Anery, is that it's very difficult to identify competence or quality of education. So instead, they find these other stand-ins. So you think of things like acceptance rate. You look at what majors people have and how much money they make after college. But the one I really want to focus on here is acceptance rate. Now, just to highlight, you might just think that like, oh, this is just some ranking system put out by a magazine, but this stuff matters. Why does this stuff matter? Why does the rank you have on the US News and World Reports matter? Well, part of it's what Marcus said is in terms of your rank is turned into prestige. And people like to feel prestigious and associated with prestigious places. So the higher a school is on the rankings, what are they more likely to get? Well, where does money Marcus?
Yeah, so like what Khalid, if I'm pronouncing that right, said, yeah, a better job.
Yeah, better job. So one thing is if you see somebody who went to a prestigious school, you're just gonna, and you're like somebody looking through resumes, because if you get 400 resumes, you're just gonna have to find some way to quickly flip through them. So you see like, oh, this person went to Yale. Yale's a good school. They must be good. I know they're like second on the US News and World Report ranking. So yeah, let's bring them in. And so people who didn't go to these prestigious schools get hurt. Another thing that ends up happening, so you get a better salary and better job. Another issue that ends up happening is at many, so a college like Harvard, a private university, where does most of Harvard's money come from? Anyone know?
Donation?
Yeah, donations. It comes from donations generally from former graduates. So basically, Harvard is going to get money from donations from people who went to Harvard. Now, because of this, the more prestigious a school is, the prouder someone's going to be of that, and the more likely they are to give money. Also, if it's more prestigious and they've gotten a better job, they're going to have more money to give back to their prestigious school. So it creates this sort of round and round and round we go sort of thing, where what ends up happening is the schools that are very prestigious end up spitting out people who make more money, who then donate it back into the school, and it becomes very difficult to break out. Now, so these differences in your rankings are really important. And this ties in with acceptance rate, because if you were to guess, you are a school, you want to go up in your prestige rankings. Because also things like the higher score you get, very often like the president of the college might get a bonus. If you go up 10 spots in the rankings, you as the head of the college might be given $100,000 bonus that year, simply for raising your spot 10 in the rankings. Donors will say, why on earth are we falling in the rankings? This is unacceptable. The board of trustees will get mad. If you're a state school, the state might cut funding if you aren't doing a good enough job and decide it's better spent elsewhere. So these prestige rankings matter. And they're calculated in these ways all of you said. So given all of this, it might seem like a very fair way of doing it. And the way they come up with these rankings of like what counts as a good school is basically through data mining, in which they get all these numbers and then they mine it all together through an algorithm. And they find like people who are on the Supreme Court and go to this school. It's basically just finding these correlations and running an algorithm. So here's the question though, and this is where the problems come in, because when you start looking at correlations and not causation, you end up with these very strange ways in which the system gets manipulated. So imagine that you are the president of a college and your board of trustees or your state government has said over the next 5 years, the number one thing you need to do is raise us in the US News and World Report rankings. That is very important to our community and our prestige as a state and a college. So they tell you, we just got a donation for $20 million. You, as the president, need to decide where this $20 million goes. Imagine you are, say, I don't know, what's a random state? University of Idaho. That's a random state. You're the president of the University of Idaho and you were just given $20 million. Your goal is to improve your US News and World Reports ranking, showing that you're improving school. That's what the point is, how good of an education you get. That's what the ranking's supposed to show. If you want your school to raise up in the rankings as quickly as possible and go with the biggest ranking, there's a correct answer to this, by the way. This isn't like it's a trick question, but it's also like there is an actual answer here. Where should you put this money? Where's the best place to put the money to raise your US News and World Report ranking to indicate that you have a better education than you did before? What's the best department to put your money into? The best infrastructure? What is the #1 way to raise your ranking? Anyone have any guesses? Scholarships. Good idea. You'd think you'd get more interesting students. Not the right answer, but a good guess. And actually a better guess than what the actual answer is. Get excellent professors. Again, you'd think, well, we pay professors higher salaries. We get better. Again, is in truth probably raises the quality of the education a lot, but it doesn't affect your ranking that much. Employment rate. So you mean like how many people you hire? Again, seems like it would help because smaller class sizes are generally correlated. However, it's not the #1 biggest way of raising it.
Professor, I'm thinking about like a more corrupt way, actually.
Yeah, so what are you guessing?
I'll just donate to whoever makes the ranking, but I don't know. I don't know if that makes.
I mean, that is a way that you could do it, is you pay off the people. But let's pretend we're not doing it cheatingly. I mean, if you gave them the 20 million, that would probably be the most effective. But that's another guess. So advertising is actually along the right path, Ibrahima, but a particular type of advertising. I'll give you a clue of the best department to put your money in.
Oh, sports.
Yeah, if you want to seem like you've improved your quality of education, the best place to put that $20 million is in the athletics department. Why on earth would that be the case? How many of you have taken an athletics class in college?
No, Professor, no. I think that goes tied to like your advertising better your school.
So that's exactly it. And as Anna Marie says, it's passion. And specifically, what ends up happening is if you have a good sports team, people talk about your college more. And more importantly, people who want a sports experience at a big state school are more likely to go there. And more importantly, they're more likely to apply. So the more people who want to go there and the more that apply, what ends up happening? What goes down?
Or the rate of acceptance, of course.
Yeah, the acceptance rate goes down simply because you have more people who want to go there for the totally unrelated reason that you've got a kick-ass basketball team. So there's this very strange thing where the #1 way to improve looking like a good college is to pour your money into something that does not actually improve the education whatsoever. So what you end up with is, because of this correlation does not equal causation thing, what ends up happening is these rankings don't really end up reflecting what counts as an actually good education. Instead, they get exploited. And so the classic case of this is that TCU, Texas Christian University, about 10 years ago skyrocketed up the rankings, and it was entirely because their football team got good. It had nothing to do with the quality of the education you actually got there. If anything, it may have gone down as more and more money was diverted into the football team. But because the acceptance rate went down. The US News and World Report ranking was saying, Texas Christian, great school, great school. And not only that, it ends up that people started recognizing Texas Christian, hiring more people who went to Texas Christian. And what you end up with is this corrupted, messed up system in which we end up hiring people based on how much money, people get a benefit in hiring based on how much money was spent by their college's athletics department, which is just like a totally crazy way in which this sort of thing can happen. So the whole point of this is all of this sort of thing is made possible via data mining. And this is the sort of case in which, like, on the one hand, as Marcus said, your life is made easier, but because it's so much easier to come to conclusions that look scientific, what we end up with are these systems that are designed with the most noble of intentions in mind. But what ends up happening is these algorithms based on data mining end up spitting out conclusions that end up being biased and not showing what they're supposed to show. Jorge, were you going to say something?
I was going to say, Professor, but we've seen these systems like before there was all this technology. So we're just following a trend that has been in place for longer than computers.
So this is a great thing to say. Is these sorts of things have been around for a long time. The difference is that now you can do it and just say, computers said so. So here's an example. It becomes much more difficult to point to cases of like bias and things like racism when the way that it's brought about is through these computer programs, because the computer program doesn't test for things like race. Like if we look back, it's almost like we are keeping the same systems around, but by hiding it through these data mining type techniques, it's much harder to identify the biases and the negative impacts that these things have. So like we've always had a case in which having a good sports team leads to people thinking your school is better. Give me a second to stop the video. I think I just got blurry. However, the difference is now people don't necessarily realize it's going on. And the other thing is, because of the nature of the interconnected world, this information gets out faster and can have a much quicker response. So on the one hand, Jorge, you're 100% right. This sort of thing has been going on forever. However, the scale in which it's able to happen with this interconnected world is very much new. And more importantly, though, it's in some ways, because the way in which these biases have been programmed into the algorithms, what ends up happening is that we don't realize they're going on and they don't end up getting talked about, because if you ask the company, they just say, well, our algorithm spits out that this is the better college, so that must be the case. So they become these self-fulfilling prophecy things that become very, very difficult to talk about. And in some ways, just keep perpetuating the very same sorts of problems that we've had in this country for a very long time, only they get put under this little heading of, and your life is getting easier, look, data mining, look, numbers. There's been some other cases of data mining gone wrong. So for instance, there was a case the other year in which they found that, what was it? It was some health related thing in which people of color were much less likely to be offered, it was something along the lines of, I'm having trouble remembering this, but it was basically, so there was this case in which you had these medical companies that were telling white people that they needed surgery for certain sorts of conditions, and they were telling Black people the same issues that they were not needing to go in for surgery. And the problem was that this was surgery that people needed. It just was white people were being told they needed to get the surgery at higher rates than Black people who needed the surgery just as much. And the reason why this happened is that these companies had a number of how healthy are you, or health history. So basically, they were the thinking was, well, if this person has never had a pre-existing condition, what they have now means they don't need surgery. But if they do have pre-existing conditions or have a history of ill health, they do need the surgery. And so the problem was, because medical data is largely private, the company that was deciding this didn't actually see what someone's health history was, or even if they did, they needed a very quick and dirty way of deciding, does this person have a long history of health problems or not? So can anyone guess what they were using as the stand-in for, has this person been healthy over the past 10 years? Because they couldn't necessarily look at all the medical records, and different people have different number of medical records. So they just thought, we need some way of deciding who's healthy, who's not. Well, here was their thinking. It was perfectly innocent. They weren't trying to be racist. They thought, well, if you're not healthy, where do you go a lot?
If the doctors, if you don't go to the doctors often, most likely you're healthy.
Their thinking was perfectly innocuous of, well, if you spend a lot of money at a doctor, you're probably not healthy. And if you don't spend a lot of money at the doctor, you probably are healthy. So that was their thinking, was, how much money did you spend at the doctor? What's the problem with this? What's another reason you might not spend money at a doctor?
You feel like that it's not worth the cost.
Yeah, if it's not worth the cost, or you quite literally don't have insurance, or you don't have the money to go to the doctor's office. And people who don't have insurance and money at the doctor's office, Jorge.
No, I was going to say that you're simply too poor to go see the doctor.
So what ended up happening is they were trying to identify healthy people, but instead all they did was identify who's poor. And what they did is they confused healthy for poor. And as we talked about in the United States, also they might not trust medicine. So it might be something along the lines of less educated people. So what ended up happening is people who were poorer were getting judged as more healthy. Now, what's the problem in this country? What did we say before? Jorge, I think, brought this up. What is money or average income correlated with?
Or your race.
Your race. So what ended up happening is they were looking at these statistics, and white people were being told to get surgery and Black people were not, because of the fact that Black people were poorer, therefore less likely to have large health bills, therefore less likely to be identified as someone with a pre-existing condition. And what this is a case in which using these sorts of data mining techniques and guesses is like, well, yes, it's true that spending more money on health is correlated somewhat with a worse health history, but it's not a perfect correlation. And there are other confusing causes as to why you might not spend money on these things. So if you end up relying on the correlation gathered through data mining of health history with money, what you end up doing is people who are desperately in need of health assistance don't end up getting it because they are poor. And it just ends up perpetuating this cycle in which people of color are given worse off treatment for this reason of, and this is, Jorge, is what I wanted to say about the ways in which it's different. Where like before we had computer programs making these decisions, you couldn't have a racist computer program that didn't realize it was racist and created it for entirely innocent ways. So it's almost like a new way in which systematic racism or systematic sexism can get into the system. And these cases are much harder to identify. Like if somebody's being explicitly racist, you just point at them and say, you're being racist. It's easy to identify. But when the racism is built into this system in an innocent, not trying to be racist way, it can have the same effect of people of color getting treated worse. Only the issue is that nobody even realizes it's happening until somebody points it out. Jorge.
Oh no, Professor, I had I'm muted by mistake.
Okay, just didn't want to cut you off. So does everyone, so this is basically taking the privacy worries and running with it. Because the amount of data that we now have out there allows data mining like this. And because there's so much money to be gained in these sorts of big data calculations, like the company that came up with this sort of program, the one that identified how healthy are you, made a ton of money off of it. And it was only after it was up and running that people started to realize, like, oh, because of this data mining, because of the way the system learned, it had these biases built in, and it ended up treating people different. Now, this idea that we're going to, or the ways in which technology kind of, we like to think of technology as unbiased and almost giving us an objective way of looking at reality and making sure that, like, our ancient biases aren't there. But in truth, what can end up happening is that our biases get built into the technology itself. And that's something we're going to be talking about more later in the semester with things like racist facial recognition and things along those lines. Does anyone have any last questions about data mining? Anybody?
No, Professor, I was going to say from what I was reading, it's not necessarily bad. It's the way we use it, you know?
Yes, exactly. And that's the thing. Computers aren't evil. They're computers. They're pieces of machinery. Programs aren't evil. The issue is that they can pick up our biases and the way we treat people by just the way in which we accidentally interact with those computers. So, like, just to give an example that we'll be coming back to, the way artificial intelligence programs work, actually, you know what? No, I'm going to save this till later in the semester. But yeah, they aren't racist. It's rather that they accidentally pick up on our racism and the ways in which our society is set up. And then as our machines learn, they pick up our biases.
Professor, I was going to say, it makes sense because they are a product of us, you know, and we have all these problems.
Exactly. And that's the thing, it's like any computer is programmed by a human, and human society is not perfect and has biases. All right, any last questions before I move on to topic number 2? All right, so I'm going to pause here for a second because I need to grab some water. And so I'm going to do the first little break of the semester. I will be back at 12:16, which is 3 minutes from now. So if you want to get up, stretch your legs or anything, I'm going to pause the recording and be back in 3 minutes. And then we'll just push through and finish the class for the day. Today's class. All right, paper writing. This final bit of the class is literally just going to be me talking about how to write philosophy papers, because I know a lot of you have not taken a philosophy class before or haven't written a paper in a long time. And my goal is to make the paper writing process as painless as possible. Paper writing is, some people love to write, some people hate it. And unfortunately, it's something we all have to do at some point in our lives. And very often we're not told what we have to do, why we're doing it. So I just want to spend the last little bit of just talking about what paper writing is, why I think it's a skill that's important, and what it is that I'm looking for in your paper. So first question, why on earth are you asked to write papers in school? And I'm asking this as just a big picture thing. And I'm bringing this up because very often we lose sight of why we're doing it, and why we're trying to write the paper is often crucial for writing the paper well. So why are you asked to write papers?
It's usually to either argue or inform people of stuff.
So that's that is the particular aim, but more generally, why does a teacher care about your ability to argue? Why does a teacher care about any of this stuff? So one thing Cynthia says is practice formal expression. Anytime you apply for a job, you are going to be writing a cover letter. And what is a cover letter? It's a persuasive, short persuasive piece of writing designed to convince them to interview you. That's what it is. It's a formal piece of expression designed to say, here's why you should hire me. So one reason you're being taught writing or asked to write is to practice this experience, practice this writing process. What's another reason? Well, what are your papers about?
A given subject.
Yeah, they're about given subject. Yeah, so it's to show you learned the material, because as a matter of fact, basically what writing a paper is you are teaching an imaginary audience something about the topic. When you're writing a paper for a class, you're not just saying, here's what I did today on Sunday. Yeah, it shows you understand it, and here's the fact, you never truly understand something until you can teach it to somebody else. I've had many, like, how many of you have had this experience in which you thought you understood something for a class, your friend asks you, wait, how do you solve that one again? And then you quickly realize you don't know what you're talking about. You thought you knew, but until you tried to teach someone, you didn't know. And that's basically what writing is, because what you're doing when you're writing is you are producing a piece of language to an imaginary audience or to a teacher later on to teach them what it is that you've learned. So that's the other, show what you've learned and show that you can organize it in a way that practices your ability to express things formally. Now,
no,
yeah.
I'm sorry to cut you off. I was gonna say, like, in order for me to teach something, what I've experienced is like you have to be almost an expert in some subject to be able to teach it.
And that's exactly the thing. And writing a paper, it might be a very small topic, but writing a paper, basically to be able to teach in a good paper, forces you to become an expert in whatever that small topic is. So even if it's something small about privacy, you might have learned a lot from me by listening about privacy. You will learn more writing a paper about privacy, because you will really have to grapple with what it means to be left alone, what these different types of privacy are, what the examples are. So it forces you to really in-depth learn something. And it's also practicing becoming in-depth, because there are going to be times with technology changing, you are going to join a job, and then there's going to be some new piece of software that you have to learn in that job. If you have practiced becoming an expert in something on your own, you are going to be a much, much more valuable employee to them going forward in a world that's ever changing. So yeah, it's to practice your formal expression, show you've learned the material, and practice becoming a self-taught expert. And here's the difference in this class, and why papers are useful is, in a class like this, I can give you feedback and work with you to help you become an expert in this thing you're talking about. Once you get into a job, you know, getting a C in something sucks, but you learn a lot. But getting a C in something sucks a lot less than getting fired from a job. So it's better to learn how to do these things in college so that the end of the semester comes around, you are prepared for that job, that you are going to be the expert. You've put in the time, you've worked hard. So that's the general idea behind paper writing. Now, with that in mind, why are there different types of papers for different sorts of classes? Well, because different classes have different demands. And in philosophy, it's a particular type of paper writing. What you'll find for different classes is what they're looking for is going to be different depending on what the class is. So sometimes, if it's a creative writing class, you have to show that you know how to engage a reader, keep their attention, and keep a narrative going. If you're writing a recipe, like a cooking class, you have to know how to give instructions that are clear, easy to follow, few words. If you're taking a journalism class, you need to learn how to use short sentences that people can follow. In a philosophy class, you're learning how to give reasoned defenses of some claim. It's in a philosophy class, it's about taking a particular one idea and then building an entire paper to show that idea is correct and that the person reading your paper should agree with you at the end. And you do that not just by saying what your feelings are, not just by being interesting, but rather by giving reasons and using those reasons together to defend the claim. So in any sort of paper that is built around one claim or one idea, what is our word that we have for the main idea or the sentence that captures the main idea that the rest of the paper is built around? It's the most important sentence in a paper of this sort. Any guesses? It has 6 letters. Thesis, yes, your thesis. Whenever you're writing a paper like this, there's one idea that everything else is geared towards. And a reasoned defense of some claim is going to be geared towards your thesis. Now, to show you that this is not some made up thing, or like theses are just some academic thing that we talk about, any sort of writing, any sort of interaction with another person in which you're trying to get them to come to some conclusion can be framed as a thesis. So for instance, going back to that cover letter, your cover letter has a thesis. What is the thesis of your cover letter? You apply to a job, you include a cover letter on the front of your application.
It's basically like, oh, you promised something, like, and like you promised to do this. So like in the thesis in the paper, it's just like, oh, like what you're trying to argue and like how and like the reason that like that your argument is correct or whatever.
So in a paper, you're trying to argue that why one thing is correct. And in your cover letter, you're also trying to argue that one thing is correct. And as Andrea just said, it's that you are the right candidate for that job. A cover letter, the right candidate for the job. When you and your friend are arguing whether to have pizza or hamburgers for dinner, you have a thesis you're arguing for. Your thesis is we should have pizza. And then everything else you do to try to convince them to get pizza that night, it's cheaper, it's easier to get, it travels better. Those are all your reasons defending that thesis. So when you're thinking about these papers, these aren't things that are totally unrelated from your everyday lives. They're rather just an extreme written formal way of going about practicing every day, convincing someone that you're right by giving them evidence instead of like, because you can always convince someone that you're right by hitting them over the head until they agree. But that's not always going to work. You need to sometimes convince people by giving them good thoughts, good arguments. And that's what these papers are working on. Your goal by the end of this paper is to have one thesis that you're arguing for, and with that thesis to then build an entire multi-paragraph paper that is designed to prove that your thesis is correct. So first question then is, what are these topics? What are the possible theses? I'm going to now share my screen for those of you who did not check out the Blackboard yet. The prompts for the papers are now posted, and this is what they look like. Let's make sure this is the correct one. All right. So can everyone see this? It should say Cyber Ethics Paper Assignment 1. Does this look familiar?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So these are the, let me make this a little bigger so I can actually see it, because I can't actually see myself over top of this screen. Okay. So I will start by just going over the logistics of this paper, which is right here. 3 to 5 page paper responding to one of the following 3 prompts. The paper's due on Blackboard by the end of the day, Thursday, March 25th. I'm going to talk about these logistics things in a second, but I just wanted to read that quickly. Now, here are the prompts themselves. You are being asked to respond to only one of these 3 prompts. You do not have to respond to all 3. In fact, if you try to respond to all 3, you will give yourself way, way, way too much work. So what that means is you just have to read these 3 topics. The first one is basically, I'm going to paraphrase here. Imagine that we live in an alternate reality where instead of having the nice vaccines we actually have, the government screwed up, rushed out vaccine transmission, and people start dying from a COVID vaccine. And it turns out the issue was in a handful of different bugs used by the company to create this vaccine. The core question is, this is the second prompt. So that's this one. So prompt number 2 is, the core idea is that this company has been offered this vaccine, it's a bad vaccine. The core question is, who is responsible for these deaths and what should be done to them? So your possible theses are going to be things like the company is responsible for the deaths. The government is responsible for the deaths. No one's responsible for the deaths. Those are the possible theses you could have, something along those lines. This first one is, imagine that the government mandates a COVID tracker app that you have to download to your phone, and you have to plug in your most recent COVID test. You have to say when you've had COVID, and then anyone looking at the app can see if anyone who's had a positive test is near them at that moment. The question is, should this app be allowed, or should it be made illegal? So your possible prompts are, or your possible theses are, yes, it should be allowed, no, it shouldn't be allowed, or something like, yes, it should be allowed, but only if conditions X, Y, and Z are met. So those are the sorts of things I'm talking about with theses. The third one is going to be about something we haven't actually talked about yet. It's going to be talked about next time. But if you want to get a head start on this one, the basic idea is, imagine North Korea breaks into the servers of Google and Facebook and causes a lot of damage. You somehow become president, and some people are demanding a military response. Others say you shouldn't do anything. What's the correct thing to do in response as the president of the United States? So those are the possible theses you can have in these sorts of arguments. That's all I mean by the thesis, is the one sentence summary that you would give explaining what your paper will be arguing. So does everyone understand here, with those three prompts, what the possible theses are? So where does your evidence come from? Now, this is the next step in which I want to talk about how this paper should be structured and how you should go about in the writing process. So we have two things to say here. One is how to go about writing, and two, what does a good paper look like? So with these prompts, and the way I give these prompts is they are designed to give you an imaginary situation that is basically an example of a general topic we talked about in class. So we've got privacy, we've got responsibility in the many hands problem, we've got problems of security in the international world with different governments. And the way I want you to answer these questions is focus on that case, but then for the evidence, either point to particular things from the prompt I give you, or talk about things from class that are related to it. So for instance, in the privacy one about the COVID tracker app, you're going to want to bring up things like data mining or hacking or the possible security risks. So that's how it's going to incorporate. The focus will be on this imaginary case I give you, but you will be using that imaginary case as a means to show your knowledge of the more general topics. And so to answer Howard's question now, but it's one I'll come back to, basically, yes, you can use real life examples. Yes, you can use personal examples. Here's the thing about a philosophy paper, where you are allowed to use just about anything you want, so long as it helps prove your point, and prove your point in a way that is reasoned and gets your point across by illustrating that you are correct. So if you say, Professor, the reason you shouldn't allow the COVID tracker app is if you don't agree with me, I'm going to kill your dog, that's not showing it in a reasoned way. If, however, you show like, this directly ties into something that happened to me and my family last year. Last year, my mom had her, and you explain a hacking case. That's great. That's perfect. It's very open-ended. And this is where I go into the what a good paper looks like. So the first thing I want to say is, should you go about writing it? Step one, read prompts. You only have to write on one, so figure out which of the three prompts interests you the most. And then once you've done that, forget about the other two. You don't have to worry about them. You don't have to think about them ever again. They were just there to give you choices. So step one, read the prompts. Step two, decide your thesis. So just by reading the prompts, there on the prompt, either underlined or in bold, is going to be the core questions that the thesis is going to ask. So what you need to do now is ask yourself, what do I want my thesis to be? If I'm choosing the first one, do I believe that this app should be allowed, or do I not believe it should be allowed? Or do I believe that it should be allowed for certain people, but not others? If I think that the North Korean government should, if I'm deciding on the third one, North Korea's hacked into Google, do I think that North Korea should be bombed? Do I think North Korea should be left alone? Do I think it's somewhere in between? If it's the second one, if I think that, if I'm looking at who's responsible for the screwed up vaccine, do I think it's the company? Do I think it's the government? Do I think it's the employees? What are my thoughts on it? And for these two, you honestly do not need to write anything at this point. This can be done on your head on a walk. This can be done while you're sleeping. This can be done while you're eating. Just have it. The sooner you read the prompts, the more you can let your ideas bop around in your head in the back. And then suddenly you might realize this is the one that interests me. This is the prompt. So the sooner you read the prompts over, you can just read them once, forget about them for a week, because the fun thing about the human mind is it will solve problems in the unconscious bopping around. Has anyone other than me ever solved a problem in your sleep? Like you think about something really, really hard before you go to bed, and then you'll just sit bolt upright in the middle of the night and be like, oh, I have the solution. I know I'm not alone in this because I've read of other people, but.
Usually, Professor, when I walk outside and I'm relaxed, I'm not even studying, and I start to think about the problem just with a clearer head, I guess.
And that's another good thing is here's the thing about writing, is somewhere along the line, because nobody told us how to write or how to go about it, something happened where we became conditioned like little dogs with like bells and food, that staring at a blank screen should induce terror. And so because of this, if you just sit down in front of your computer with no ideas, I genuinely think there's nothing in the world that scares me more than a blank Word document. I'm terrified of it. So what I've done to try to get around this fact is before I ever sit down in front of the computer, I just jot down some notes by hand, or I go for a walk and think about it. And so by doing this, you can find a way to engage in the first couple steps of the writing process in a way that reduces your own stress. I've taken to writing on my cell phone sometimes, just in like a notes app, where I just walk around and type on my phone. I have walked into strangers, which, is less than ideal, but it's a way of just reducing the amount of stress around staring at a blank computer screen. So anything you can do to change up the routine, and the sooner you think about these things, the easier it will be for those things to pop out of your head. And as soon as you have some ideas in the back, the rest flows a bit more naturally. So once you decide on your thesis, this is what comes next. Start outlining structure, which brings us to over here. There's basically 4 main parts to an argumentative paper for this class. We have paragraph 1. Describe case. And what's at issue. Thesis. Optional. So basically the way to think about these papers, and this goes back to what the point of the paper is. The point of the paper is to show your ideas in such a way that the reader is able to know why your thesis is correct. So the way to think about it is treat it as if the person reading your paper has never thought about this stuff before. Pretend it's not me, or even better, pretend that I've been hit over the head with a hammer and am then trying to read your paper despite the fact I'm dizzy and concussed. Because if you can explain your ideas in a clear enough way that a concussed person could understand it, that's how you want to go about this. You want it well organized, you want it well structured, because philosophical ideas are hard, and you really want to make sure that your ideas are laid out in such a way that the person reading this will understand why your paper is good and why the thesis, even if at the end of the day they don't agree with you, why the reasons you gave are good reasons and that your arguments hold together. So the way to do that, to start off, is the first thing to do in the first paragraph is just describe the case in your own words. That's important because the prompt is what's at issue. The prompt is what your whole thing is about. So if somebody were reading this paper for the first time and never heard of this topic, and you start talking about the COVID tracker app or about North Korea, like they're not going to understand what's at issue. So start off by just showing me, the reader, what the main issues are, and then also showing yourself and your teacher that you understand the key aspects of the case. Once you do that, you can then say exactly what your thesis is. And this is one of the main issues that can come up, is by not having a thesis early enough in a paper. Philosophy papers are tough. These ideas, privacy, security, all this stuff is kind of vague. It's tough to wrap your head around. And so if you do not tell your reader what you're going to be arguing for right at the start, it's going to be harder for them to follow along. Don't make your paper like a whodunit mystery novel. In a mystery novel, you don't want the reader to know who the murderer is until the last page. This is different. I want to know what your thesis is right at the start. Then the third part of this first paragraph is what I call the game plan, or a roadmap. So what this essentially is a series of sentences that tells the reader what to expect next. So this would be things like, in order to show why blah, 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 I'm first going to do this, then I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this, and then I'll conclude. Now, I say that's optional because you can have an excellent paper without it. However, including a game plan in which you tell the reader explicitly what to expect will help you, the writer, keep your ideas organized and help the reader know what comes next. So if they've been reading, I don't know, 50 papers in a row and their head is fuzzy, they're still able to follow along with what your argument is. Any questions at this point about this first paragraph, how to think about it? And when you're planning your paper, I find it useful to literally put A, B, C and write out what you think about writing. Like, this is the first time in which you can write it out. Any questions thus far on these general sorts of things, or any other questions you have? All right. Well, if that's done, I'm now going to talk about paragraph 2. Paragraph 2 is the necessary definitions and background ideas. So, as I said, philosophy papers are complex and they involve a lot of difficult, vague ideas. Things like privacy, things like security, things like responsibility. So, at points in your paper, you're going to have to talk about these things, and a lot of them are things that can be used in multiple different ways, like we talked about. Necessary definitions. So if you're going to be talking about different, like we talked about last class, you have different types of privacy. So if you're going to be focusing on some and not others, you need to define which ones they are. You need to, if you're going to be talking about data mining, it can be helpful to, if your entire paper is basically going to argue like one reason why this is a problem is data mining. Well, you're going to want to say what data mining is. So if you, for very general definitions, so if you're talking about privacy or security, you're going to want to talk about a paragraph. You're going to want a paragraph in which you define terms like that. And you're also going to want to describe like the key background. So if in your describe what's at issue, you just very briefly say something like, in this paper, I'm going to discuss the COVID tracker app, which does yada yada. In this paragraph, you might want to say something like, the first thing we have to consider before seeing why the COVID tracker app is wrong is a little more about the mechanics of how this app is going to work and who's going to have access to the data. So this second paragraph is basically just give the reader any background information they might need to follow along with your reasoned defense. Because remember, your ultimate goal and everything in the paper is to argue for this thesis. This thesis is the core idea. And so everything you do should be tied into showing that your thesis is correct. And sometimes the reasons you give to support your thesis are going to be things that you need a little background to understand. So that's what this paragraph 2 is. Now, sometimes you can get away without a paragraph of this sort. However, I generally find it helpful to have something in this spot of background. Paragraph 3 to paragraph N. Now, paragraph 3 to paragraph N. Why is there an N? Well, because the number of paragraphs in this section is up in the air. These are your reasons paragraphs. These are basically your reasons to think the thesis is correct. So if you're arguing, to give a classic example from a sample prompt, which I'm going to send around to people, or a sample paper, well, let's just go with another version of it, an act utilitarian. Say the question you're asked in your paper is the trolley problem, and you have to decide, should I push the button or not? If your thesis is, no, I should not press the button, then your reasons are going to be things like, your reasons are going to be things along the line of, you shouldn't press the button because it's killing, or you shouldn't press the button because you can't predict the future and you might be causing more harm than good. Or you shouldn't press the button because the reason you'd think you should press the button is act utilitarianism, and act utilitarianism is a bad theory. Those are the sorts of things that I mean by reasons. So in these sorts of cases, like the COVID tracker app, you might say something like, you shouldn't allow this app because reason 1, it's an invasion of privacy, and reason 2, it puts people at physical risk. Those are what your reasons are. So in these paragraphs, you want to go through your reasons. So 4, which kind of 3A and 3B go hand in hand, which is come up with your reasons. So your reasons are the main core ideas that would prove your thesis, or the main evidence you're giving. So anytime you have a thesis, so for instance, in your job application letter, your cover letter, the thesis is hire me. Your reasons in that cover letter would be things like, I'm an incredibly hard worker and I speak 17 languages. Each of those would be reasons. So reason 1 would be, I'm an incredibly hard worker. Reason 2 would be, I speak 17 different languages. So these can be thought of as your general ideas. So the first thing you want to do is find out or think of what those reasons are. And this kind of goes back in with this bit with the necessary definitions. What your reasons are going to be tied in with what background information you need. If you're going to be talking about privacy, you're going to need to define privacy. If you're not talking about privacy, you don't have to bring it up. Just ignore it. Only bring up things that are directly related to your reasons. So the majority of the length of your paper is this third part. And this is going to be multiple paragraphs for your however many reasons you have. Paragraph N+1, or paragraph last, is just a short conclusion in which you just summarize everything that comes before, in which you just say, in this paper, I showed yada yada. So that's what the fourth part is. That's what the outline is. So once you've come up with your reasons and started outlining, 4 is going to be, what support do you give that your reasons are good? And this right here, this what support do you give that your reasons are good, this is really the main work of the paper. If you don't do 1, 2, and 3A and B, your paper is probably not going to end up being great. It might not even, if you don't do 1, 2, and 3, it's even going to be hard for you to write a good paper. But where the good papers and the great papers separate themselves is in this fourth part. Because what comes next, and where most of the time will be spent, is just filling out these reasons and explaining why they show what you say they show. So for instance, if you're going on the COVID tracker app and your first reason is it's an invasion of privacy, you have to ask yourself, how am I going to show that this is an invasion of privacy? Well, assuming I've already defined what privacy is, you're going to have to give maybe examples, give quotations, explain why it's such a problem. And this is where the real work gets done of proving to the reader that you fully understand the topic. So this will be things like, the first way in which this violates your privacy is because it allows for data mining. And so then you would dive in and show everything you need to explain why that's such a problem. So this is where the real work gets done, is what support do you have? And then 5 is write the damn thing. So this is generally how I think about going about it. Now, this is where the real work comes in. So I want to leave this up here for a second, because I don't want to erase this because it's up here, but I do want to talk about what can reasons look like, or how many reasons do you need, or what makes good reasons. And this is where they're very, very open-ended. And this is where the real devil of the details comes in, because what determines whether your reasons are good ones is what would it take to convince a reader that your reasons are good ones and therefore your thesis is correct. So there is no set recipe for doing this. Instead, what you have to do is think, I need to think what somebody else would have to hear to think that what I'm thinking now is correct. So it's a lot of tough thought. And this is why paper writing, anyone who writing comes easy to, I envy you. Now, what can reasons look like? Here are things they can include. It could be a counter argument. So for instance, 2 ways of proving you're right. One is to show you're right. The other is to show the other person's wrong. So what you could do is say something like, if you think that this isn't a problem, here's why it is actually a problem. Or you might say, now somebody might disagree with my argument, but that worry is wrong for this other reason. So reasons can include, I'm going to erase over here now. This will be up on the recording. So things that can go in the reasons section include things like negative consequences, positive / negative consequences of your view. Positive or negative, positive consequences of your view. Negative consequences of opponents. I just cannot spell today. View. Example that illustrates general point. Response to a potential counter argument. So any of these are allowed. How many reasons does a good paper have? There's not an answer to that question. But generally, it is better to go into few reasons in depth than many reasons in just a little bit. It shows, if somebody can explain to you one feature of like 47 different cars, they're not a mechanic. But even if a person has never worked with more than one car, but they can explain it in incredible depth, that shows they really understand the topic. They can explain how it works. So these are all the different sorts of things you can do in this. And there's many other ways you can do it. Now, what these look like in practice, I'm going to be emailing out and posting a sample paper that shows some of these things. But basically what you need to ask yourself is, what do I need to say to convince my reader that my thesis is correct and that this reason that I'm giving for my thesis is a good supporting reason? So there's not really a concrete answer to what good versus bad reasons are. It's just you have to put yourself in the mindset of somebody who's reading your paper and identifying what they would need to do to understand your argument and why your thesis is a good one. All right, so does that make sense in this general sort of looking at reasons, what reasons are? Because I now want to talk about just some more practical things of how to go about it, things I care about, things I don't.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, spelling. Don't worry about it. I don't care about spelling. If English is not your first language, I don't care if your sentences aren't grammatical. All I need is to be able to understand what you're trying to get across. So make sure that you do your best to make yourself clear, but if it's spelled wrong, if it's ungrammatical, I really don't care. Small words equals good. These ideas are hard and complicated enough as is. The smaller the words, the easier it is for someone to follow along with. If you can put into small words, you can really show that you understand something. Along with that, what's the smallest? Well, there's two smallest words in the English language. One of them you've probably been told many times not to use in papers. I am saying I. The word I is a good word to use in these papers. You're allowed to say things like, I'm now going to do this. I'm now going to do that. I think this. I think that. Don't be afraid to say I. It's very helpful and can help you structure your papers. All right, erase this. All right, can everyone see this? This is what I call a signpost. It's right in the glare, so maybe I can block it a little bit. Here we go. What it says is, now that I've shown blank, I will argue blah, 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 because this will demonstrate yada, yada. So these are sentences that go at the start of paragraphs that help you keep your paper organized and make it easier for your reader to follow along with the structure of your paper. Think of your paper as a bunch of independent paragraphs, each of which plays one role in your argument and in proving your thesis. And then once you do that, these can together combine to make a greater whole. But in order to do this, it's really, really helpful if your reader knows how you think the parts fit together. So including these things at the start is really helpful. Also, another type of signpost is just things like where you say, this shows, like after you include a quote, or after you say something, or after you bring up an example, say what this shows and why that's important. This shows which is important because. So that's the next thing I want to say, signposts. Another one I want to highlight, I just said it, but I want to say it again. Make sure each paragraph does one job and one job only. If you've got your privacy defining paragraph, only define privacy in that paragraph. If you've got a paragraph in which you talk about the consequences of North Korea's attack on the United States, only talk about that in that case. Don't include lots of different things. Stay focused on one thing at a time. So because of this, what this means is paragraphs, well, trivia question, how long does a paragraph have to be? What's the correct length for a paragraph?
Technically, there isn't really
Bingo,
any.
Marcus just nailed it. No, Marcus, you nailed it. There's not a correct answer. Rather, it's however long it needs to be. You can have a one-sentence paragraph if all you're doing is putting out. Marcus, you're the first person who's ever guessed that one right, so congratulations. Also, how many sentences? So how many sentences have to be in a paragraph? There's not a right answer. Now, 6 to 7 lines is generally about how long it's going to take, but sometimes it's just one sentence. It's however long you need to explain your point. How many words have to be in a sentence? Again, however many you need. Don't worry about the structuring, the prettiness, anything like that. In a paper like this, it's being clear. Now, citations. Do I require citations? Yes and no, but more on the no side than the yes side. If it's ever something from my lectures or something we talked about in the readings, you don't have to cite it. If it's something you find outside of class, for these papers, you are welcome to use outside sources, but you do not have to, and I'm shaking my hands just to make it clear, you do not have to use anything other than the class sources if you do not want to. If you want to, though, just make sure that you include like a hyperlink or a URL, just so if I find it interesting, I can find it myself and read more. Or if the plagiarism police came and asked, did anyone cheat? I can go, no, they gave me the URL. So I don't care about Chicago style. I don't care about MLA. If you want to do that for your own practice, feel free. I don't care. Quotations. Quotations are good, but make sure that your quotations are paraphrased afterwards. I know you all know how to do the following. I know you all know how to do this. That doesn't show me you understand. Control C, Control V. All you show me is that you literally don't even show me you have hands. You could do that with like your tongue and your nose. So that doesn't show me anything. However, what does show me that you understand is if you choose a good quote and then you put it in your own terms. So after you include a quotation, first off, you don't ever have to include a quotation if you don't want to, but if you choose to, just after you include the quote, say something like, by this, so-and-so means, and you explain it, which is significant because blah, blah, blah. Anything like that. All right, other practical things is don't be afraid to rephrase one thing you've just said in new words. So if you say something like privacy is bad because it puts you in danger, say something like, by that I mean, yada, yada, yada. Just anything to just really illustrate your point. Don't try to slow down in a paper like this and make sure you explain yourself fully. Don't repeat yourself exactly, but make sure that you've explained your ideas as fully as you can, such that somebody with a concussion would understand how all the parts fit together. All right, I'm trying to think what other general, this is probably a good time to open up discussion for any more practical questions, due dates, things like that. Does anyone have any more practical questions on the papers? All right.
Professor, so we need to upload this to Blackboard, correct?
Correct. Now, if you are having trouble with Blackboard and you have to email it to me, that's fine. But there's going to be a spot on the Blackboard opening up that I will put there. Let me pull up the due date as well. Sometimes my double screen confuses me. Okay. So, Thursday, end of Thursday, March 25th. That's the day before spring break. I decided if it was due the day before spring break, no one would show up to class on Thursday. You still might not, or on Friday. Yeah, third day. You know, that great third day. Thursday. So it's posted to Blackboard on Thursdays, or on that Thursday, you have to post it to Blackboard. Or, well, actually, Thor Day might actually be more accurate, because Thursday, you know who it's named after? It's named after Thor. Yeah, it's Thor's Day, the day of Thor, as in like, yes, the Thor who Marvel stole from Norse mythology. So yeah, so Thor Day isn't that far off of Thor's Day. So Thor isn't off Thor and Thor Day. So I'm gonna defend my my defense. And Wednesday was Woden's Day, which is another one. And July is named after Julius Caesar because that's when his birthday was, and all these other fun random facts about time. But anyway, it's due here at the end of the day. Now, I understand that everyone is busy. I understand everyone is burned out. If you need an extension on the paper, reach out to me ahead of time. Right now, with a COVID pandemic and everything else, I'm being very lenient with offering extensions. Even if it's like the night before and you've been working on it but cannot finish, just reach out. If you reach out to me ahead of time, I will be very lenient with this. Afterwards, it becomes a little harder for me to be as lenient. But generally, if you ask for an extension and you explain your reasoning, I'm almost certainly going to be able to give it to you. So just know it's due here. But if, pardon my language, shit hits the fan for you and you can't get it in, then just let me know and we'll work something out. Next thing, 3 to 5 pages suggestion is a suggestion. I will never take off points simply because a paper is too short. I will never take off points simply because a paper is too long. I only take off points if the paper is, because it's too short, it's not a good argument, or because it's too long because it's wordy. I think of 3 to 5 pages as a correlation with your grade, not a causation of your grade. So if you turn in something that's 2 pages, it can be an A paper. Why? Because you explained everything clearly and fully and succinctly. If you turn in a 20-page paper, but it doesn't repeat itself, you just bring up such a thorough investigation of this because you were interested in it and you worked hard, it's not going to affect your grade. I recommend 3 to 5 pages because in my experience, that's the range at which people tend to land when their paper gives enough detail to explain everything fully without repeating themselves over and over again. So that's just a suggestion. The last time date you need to know is 8 a.m. Monday, March 22nd. What happens at 8 a.m. Monday, March 22nd? That is the last time I'm willing to accept drafts to be read over for comments. So at any point between now and this point, if you have any questions for me about the paper and you email it to me, I'm happy to answer it. If you send me a draft of your paper, it can be just a paragraph, it can be a full thing. I will read it all over in my iPad with my little draw lines with my stylus thing and give you feedback on the draft that I think will help you improve the paper, send it back to you, and then you can correct it and include those corrections in your next draft or your final copy. I'm happy to read over however many drafts you want to give me, as hard in that I give you this deadline because I need time to get you your feedback so that you have time before the paper's due. And after this point, I don't have enough time and I've got too many things going on to be able to give your paper the attention it deserves. So after this point, I'm happy to answer any general questions. I'm happy to meet in office hours. I'm happy to do anything. However, I am not going to be able to read over full paper drafts. So that's that date. Before this point, send me whatever you want. I'll read it over. I'll give you feedback. Also, as you know, I don't have official office hours because I like to be flexible. So if at any point you want to meet with me through Zoom and we can chat about the paper writing, feel free to reach out to me and I will set up a meeting that works for both of us. My schedule is flexible. what is a weekend anymore? They don't exist. I'm locked in a house all the time anyway. So if you want to meet on the weekends, because that's when it works for you, that's fine. If you want to meet early in the day, late in the day, just reach out. We'll find a time. Don't feel any pressure to have to meet with me, but if you want to, I'm happy to meet. All right, any other questions, comments, concerns, logistical stuff?
Nope.
Okay. What happens if I get stuck after hours and only have written the word the? Because I'm not sure I fully, what is after hours here? Like after it's due or after this date? If it's after it's due, oh, sorry. Sorry, I'm not a I was never a SpongeBob watcher. So now I'm gonna be honest, I found him really annoying, and I know that makes me a bad person. But I just couldn't do SpongeBob. Any other questions? Comments, concerns, feelings? Old Nick Galodian references. Jorge.
No, thank you, Professor, for the information. Very detailed information. Thank you.
All right. So yeah, and again, if any of this video will be getting posted in a little bit. If at any point you have any questions, even if it's something like, I'm scared, I've never written this type of paper before, or I haven't written one in years, just reach out to me. My goal is to make this as painless as possible. For some people, myself included, writing is always painful, but it comes in levels. So the more we can do to make this less painful for you, the better it will be. Just reach out, any help you need. I'm around. My phone is nearby. I've got email. So if there's nothing else, have a great weekend. I will see you all next Friday, and I will talk to anybody who needs any help. Just shoot me an email. All right. Have a good weekend, everybody.
Thank you, Professor.